Hey there, Powder Keg fans. This is the final keynote of the day. We've been talking about this all day in our sessions, and I am so excited to get started. As people kind of filter in here, please go ahead and use the chat to say hello, say where you're tuning in from, maybe say what you're working on, drop your LinkedIn URL. You know what to do. Introduce yourself and be friendly the way us Unvalley folk tend to do. I'm going to introduce Steve here in just a moment, but just want to say a huge thank you to a couple of partners, Blast Media, who's been helping with PR. They are a SaaS-only PR firm that has been helping throughout this conference and so many startups around the country. JA Benefits, awesome team with growth-minded companies who really value their people and really have been a true partner for us. And finally, Genovis, an independent economic development leader in site selection, location modeling, incentive procurement, and incentive compliance management. They've been so helpful for so many companies relocating or starting HQ2s in the middle of the country, which is very relevant to what we are about to talk about. We've got someone I have traveled thousands of miles with over the last several years. And I'll tell you more about why that is. AOL co-founder Steve Case launched Revolution, a DC-based investment firm, in 2005. Revolution invests in and actively helps build companies leveraging technology to disrupt existing markets. This includes both early and mid-stage growth companies through both Revolution Growth and Revolution Ventures. The firm has always had a philosophy that great companies can start and scale anywhere, and they have helped so many companies do that. In 2014, Steve and Revolution first launched the Rise of the Rest platform to shine a light on innovation ecosystems between the coasts. The first $150 million fund launched in 2017, and the second just last year in 2019. Steve and the team have traveled over 11,000 miles to 43 cities. I think I was around for maybe about half of those on the Rise of the Rest bus to visit entrepreneurial ecosystems and highlight the great companies and entrepreneurs in these hubs. He's a big part of the reason why the Unvalley movement exists in the first place. The Rise of the Rest, we've been talking about it all day. Here is AOL co-founder Steve Case. Steve, thanks for being here today.
Hey, Mike, good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. Where are you tuning in from today?
Washington, D.C. We got a little bit of snow this morning, but not too much. Some of the folks more in the Northeast got slammed pretty good. I talked to somebody who got over a foot of snow, and it keeps coming, but we're doing fine here in D.C.
Well, I appreciate you starting a conversation in the most Midwest way possible, which is talking about the weather. I absolutely love how just watching you work in all of these different cities around the country, plugging in with city officials, plugging in with other venture capitalists who want to invest in the middle of the country. And you've seen so much. And I imagine it's very different than what you've seen this year. Tell me a little bit about some of your favorite moments. Do you have a favorite moment or two over the years? You don't have to pick favorites in terms of cities. I know it's hard to pick your favorite one, but do you have any favorite moments from the tour when back in the days when we were meeting face to face and actually able to shake hands?
Sure. I mean, for me, the journey began almost a decade ago now when I was asked by President Obama to chair an initiative called Startup America Partnership. And that got me traveling around and focused more on what's happening with startups and the role they play in job creation, and focusing on what was the different dynamics in different startup communities. And then, as you said, we launched Rise of the Rest, or did a first tour about 6 years ago, and done 8 tours so far, as you mentioned, over 40 different cities. And what was remarkable in each of those cities to me, they were a little bit different, but there were some things that were similar, was a sense of something happening. It was sort of bubbling, more of a sense of possibility about what might happen in the startup sector, usually a focus on a particular industry or sector, given the history and the strength of that particular city, but also on the negative side, not as much collaboration as we were hoping to see, which is why conferences like this are so important. The other thing I've always been struck by, again, it's been true in almost every city, is how people, the entrepreneurial set, if you will, are clustering in a particular part of the city, almost an innovation district or neighborhood, and watching what was happening there and some of the dynamics there was interesting. So as you said, now that the Rise of the Rest Fund has invested in over 150 companies in over 70 cities. We don't want to pick any favorites here. We love all the company. We love all the cities. We're trying to champion all these different cities and try to level the playing field so people everywhere have a shot at creating a company, really a shot at the American dream. But it has been encouraging to see how this has been slowly building over the last few years. Clearly, as you suggested, the pandemic has accelerated interest in what's happening, and I think that this could end up being really a tipping point for this whole movement.
I couldn't agree more. And I know as we've talked to entrepreneurs all over the country, you've had a chance to plug in there and invest there. One of the biggest problems, whether they're in the valley or outside the valley, is attracting the best talent. And what have you seen or encouraged entrepreneurs to do to attract that best talent, whether they're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Omaha, Nebraska, or Baltimore, Maryland?
Well, it starts with just looking at the data over the last several decades, and most people who are on this, participating in this conference understand this. But for most parts of the country, over the last real half century, there's been a real brain drain, where a lot of people growing up in certain cities or going to school in those cities, graduating from college or university in those cities, felt like they had to leave to go someplace else because they felt there was a bigger opportunity elsewhere, not where they were located. And we've recognized that, and we tried to figure out ways to slow the brain drain, if you will, and actually trigger a little bit of a boomerang of people returning. We have seen some examples in different cities where people are staying more now than they were 10 years ago. There's enough happening in that particular startup ecosystem, or some large companies perhaps moved a major office there, that's resulting in some of the people graduating from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, or Michigan and Ann Arbor. I could list dozens of those examples, staying when they graduate as opposed to leaving, which was the first step and a sign of some encouragement to us about what we've seen building in the last few years, and certainly accelerating in the last 7 or 8 months as we've been dealing with this pandemic, is more of this boomerang. And it started with people thinking they were going to just shelter somewhere temporarily. Maybe this would just be a couple, 3 months or something. Now that they've been there a little bit longer, some, not most, but some are starting to say, maybe I should stay here and either continue to work remotely for the company or organization I'm already working for, or maybe there's something in that particular city that I want to join a startup, or maybe I have my own idea for a startup. And so I think we're seeing it again. It's early. It's still kind of anecdotal. You hear different predictions of what might happen, but I think we have seen an acceleration of this boomerang. I think a good bit of that will be permanent and really create a unique opportunity for these rising cities to really kind of step up their game in terms of attracting talent. In terms of your question about what people can do, there's some specific initiatives that we've seen in different cities that I think have been interesting. But the most important thing is getting everybody in your city to recognize the central role entrepreneurs play, startups play in job creation. It's not just small business. Obviously, we care about small business now more than ever, given how many restaurants and other small businesses are really struggling. It's not just about your big businesses, your Fortune 500 companies. Of course, they're important as well. But it's most important to focus on the new businesses, the startups, and create more of a collaborative effort with the mayor and the governor and the CEOs of the big companies and the head of the university and the entrepreneurship support organizations. Everybody needs to do their part, but particularly need to do it in a more collaborative way. That's job one. Job two is figuring out what are the sectors where you do have a unique advantage. I mentioned Pittsburgh, robotics, because of Carnegie Mellon is strong. Not surprising, Uber last week decided to kind of double down on Pittsburgh, not Silicon Valley, in terms of their driverless car operations. We saw it in a city like Chattanooga, for example, has a lot of trucking companies, or companies like Freightways developing there. So how do you build on sort of what is unique, and sort of the legacy of your city is the second. And then there are specific initiatives. In Detroit, they do Detroit Homecoming, which I've been to a couple of times, really a way to gather people who did leave, get them to come back, expose them to some of what's happening in Detroit, expose them to some of the companies that are developing. Maybe they'll end up joining a board, or maybe they'll end up being an investor, or maybe they'll be a mentor, or maybe they'll be a customer. And some will end up deciding now it's time to move back, or what Tulsa did with the Tulsa Remote program. There's a lot of specific programs, but to me, it starts with kind of the overarching idea of how do you really make sure everybody in your community recognizes the importance of startups and does everything they can in a collaborative way to be a magnet for talent. Because you're a magnet for talent, over time, you'll also be a magnet for capital. And if you do that and also change your culture so it is more supportive of startups, is more supportive of risk-taking, things like that, then you're really kind of off to the races. Some of the cities that started that effort 20, 30 years ago are really benefiting. Austin being a visible one the last couple of weeks, with Oracle moving their headquarters and Elon Musk, deciding to shift his residency. That's not because of what Austin did in the last year. That's because of what Austin's done really over the last quarter century plus, as well as having a great iconic company like Dell kind of anchoring it, a great university kind of anchoring it. So these things take time. It's not something you just say, let's do it, and you hope that next year it's going to, it can be there. 20 plus years to build these thriving startup communities. Many have been on that journey. We've seen that firsthand, as you know. And this pandemic does give us all an opportunity to step up our game.
It really does seem like a lot of the work that you have done, and you mentioned it with the Startup America initiative, you've mentioned it with sort of the early on tour of just sort of creating more collaboration on the local level. One of the issues that a lot of sort of scaling tech companies struggle with is that sort of co-opetition of, who is the leader of the tech community versus how do you create a collaborative environment where it's a rising tide that lifts all ships. And it seems like as that has happened more on the local level over the last several years, that's now translating in between these Unvalley or Rise of the Rest cities, where those cities are seeing, hey, if we as Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati can create a rising tide together, there's going to be more opportunity for all. Do you have any examples of how cities, Unvalley or Rise of the Rest cities, are collaborating or finding ways to work together, whether that's through startups or through talent?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's the clustering, creating a sort of a critical mass of people and ideas and so forth is really important. And if it's a big city, you often can do that just in your city. But for many cities, it does require much more of a regional focus. But it's tough. I'll give you both a terrible story and a positive kind of end to it, which when I was running AOL, which was based in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia, probably now 25 years ago, I was asked to speak at a conference, I think it's called the Potomac Knowledge Way, which was an attempt to bring a regional collaborative effort to the innovation economy. So it wouldn't be just Washington, D.C. and Virginia and Maryland as separate efforts, but thinking more collaboratively, thinking more regionally, because they recognize that if you thought more, regionally, you'd be more likely to get people to want to move there and more likely to get people to want to invest in there. And people are really deciding to go to the greater Washington area. Some might choose to live in downtown DC. Some might choose to live in Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland. They really were betting on the region, not any one part of it. So I gave a speech saying, yes, we need to drive this collaboration. There really is an opportunity here, which I thought I did a pretty good job, but apparently not, because at the cocktail hour after, somebody who happened to be from the Maryland Economic Development Office came up to me and said, I really enjoyed your remarks, but what would it take to get AOL to move its headquarters from Virginia to Maryland? I was like, wow, you didn't hear anything I said. There was this classic kind of fighting between each other, kind of, win-lose, zero-sum kind of, dynamics. That was unfortunate. And as a result, I think the Washington area did not create as much of that cluster as it could have. The positive part now is part of the reason when Amazon did its second headquarters search, they ended up picking this area in Northern Virginia, is a very successful collaborative effort was put in place called the Greater Washington Partnership that did unify the area and actually went to Amazon with a unified collaborative bid saying, here's why you should come to this region. And Virginia had its argument why it should be more in Virginia, and Maryland had its argument why it should be more in Maryland, and DC had its argument why it should be more in DC. But they all recognized that if Amazon picked the area, everybody would win, and even got the mayor and the two governors to be part of this effort, got the presidents of all the universities in DC, Maryland, Virginia to be part of this effort. And I think that was impressive to Amazon, and that's part of the reason why they won. So I think that's an example of how it originally got it wrong, but eventually got it right. And as a result, are seeing more economic development and also more startup creation, because it is much more of a regional mentality as opposed to a local us versus them kind of mentality.
That's a perfect example and exactly what I was thinking of. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. One of the things that I'm thinking about right now is just this shift to remote. And obviously, there are big shifts happening with unemployment rising, more tech jobs still becoming available, but more traditional industries having more unemployment. And it seems like there's still this just huge gap that you've talked about so much. What do you think it is going to take to get those people into more tech-oriented roles and really fill this talent need that we have on the tech side, while also serving some of the needs that we have on unemployment?
It's a really tricky issue, but it starts with understanding, again, some of the data, some of the history, that this is not a new phenomenon. 200 years ago, over 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's less than 2% because technology made it easier to farm and you could grow more food with fewer people. That was a good thing because that resulted in lower food costs. But we thankfully were able to pivot from that agricultural revolution, if you will, to the industrial revolution, move people from farms to factories, which did require retraining. And as a result, this country led the way also in the Industrial Revolution. We've not done quite as good a job in the pivot from the Industrial Revolution to the technology revolution, the digital revolution. And there are a lot of people who've been left behind. Some of that requires more courses that are on tech-savvy topics, but it also requires recognizing that in this, what I've called the third wave of the internet, while of course the coding is continuing to be important, a lot of the sectors really up for grabs, ripe for disruption, are going to require systems level change, which will require collaboration and partnerships, which is a different skill set, and also require engagement and savviness around policy regulatory issues, which is also a different mindset. So it's not just about building people that can build the tech. It's also, although of course that's important, it's about building the other skill sets in your community and frankly in your company to really lead the way in this. And the last point is to recognize that the reason the startups are so important in terms of job creation is not just the jobs they create within those companies, but the spin-off, in fact, that has more broadly in the community. We saw this with AOL when we got started. It was at a couple dozen employees, and we grew to a couple hundred employees, and then thousands of employees. At our peak, it was about 10,000 employees. But in the community broadly, suddenly, because we had so many people clustered in the area, happened to be around Dulles Airport, guess what? Suddenly homes were getting constructed in the area and restaurants were opening in the area and a lot of other services were being put in place to support that broader community. And the data basically says for every startup job, there's 5 other jobs that are created in the community. So if you're not focusing on these startups, by the way, it's not necessarily tech startups. Obviously, there are a lot of tech startups, but we're seeing innovation across the whole economy in food and clothing and many other sectors. If you're not focusing on that, you're not creating the jobs of the new companies, you're not creating the jobs of the kind of industries of the future, and you're also not going to be creating the related jobs in your community that will really lift up the community and give people more of a sense of hope and possibility. That is part of the problem we have right now in the country, where there is such a divide, and some people feel great about the future, optimistic about the future, but a lot of people, actually the data suggests most people, are anxious about the future. The disruption we talk about in places like Silicon Valley is bad for their family. It's bad for their community. It feels like job loss, not job gain. And we can only offset that if we're creating jobs in each city, in some of these new companies, some of these new industries, and also benefiting from the broader spin-off impact. So it's hugely important. It's not just about any one startup city. It's about how do you create a broader focus around new companies, startups all across the country. And if we don't do that, the divide we now have in our country is only going to get worse.
You talk about so many of these big shifts and these industries in your book, The Third Wave. And I've been thinking about that a lot this year, of just now that book looks even more prescient than it did when you originally published it. So I would encourage people to go and reread the Third Wave book, because I feel like it holds up really well for this year. Obviously, we've seen healthcare really transform this year. Obviously, communications has been very much disrupted this year. What are some of the other things that you're seeing just even in your portfolio and the kind of deals that you're looking at that you're optimistic for in 2021?
Well, I would start by saying, obviously, the pandemic has had terrible impacts on our country, on the world. 300,000 people have died. I think the last number I saw was 16 million people were infected. Millions of jobs have lost. Lots of businesses have closed. It's been a tragedy on multiple levels. I don't want to make light of that. Obviously, it's been terrible. But like anything, sometimes when you have a crisis, there underneath that, if you're paying attention, there's some glimmers of hope, some silver linings, if you will. And we're seeing that. And some of them are the broader themes we talked about at the beginning in terms of this migration of talent, which I think will accelerate the rise of the rest phenomenon. I think that will be very positive for a lot of cities and over time also more broadly for our country. And you're also seeing some acceleration of some of the dynamics in particular sectors and some of the obvious ones. You mentioned communications, of course. Zoom and many other companies have seen a real acceleration in their growth as we adopt to think about this sheltering, working from home, not just being a temporary thing, but maybe a more permanent thing, or perhaps a hybrid workforce where some people are remote, some people are in the office, some people kind of switch back and forth. How does that change? And there are a lot of companies that are benefiting from that. We've obviously seen an acceleration in e-commerce and food delivery and a lot of other things. One of our companies, BigCommerce, we've seen that firsthand. Their commerce platform has seen rapid growth over the past year. We've also seen an acceleration of some trends in sectors like telehealth, which has been bubbling for really more than a decade, but really took off this year, not surprisingly, because doctors' offices were closed, and for at least many doctors' offices were closed. So suddenly, if you needed to see a doctor, you had to do it virtually, digitally. You had to embrace telehealth, and we saw that with one of our companies, Talkspace, which is in the digital mental health space, and they've seen significant growth over the past year. We've also seen companies pivot. One of our companies, Clear, is best known for airport security, kind of this fast path to get your plane faster. They decided also to expand into Health Pass and work with some sports leagues to create these safe bubbles for players and their families, and are now offering that to a variety of different organizations. So there are just a lot of things that were showing some signs of momentum and really have accelerated because of this. Some of this may go back to some sense of normalcy, if you will, but a lot of these trends I think are going to be more permanent.
Watching just the last several years, as you have been so vocal in the media and going town to town talking about the big opportunity in tech and startups, we've definitely seen a benefit as a nation from that. What can we all be doing on an individual level? We all didn't co-found AOL, so maybe we don't have as big a media presence as you do, but the collective whole of all of us talking about what makes these cities great, or these startups great, or what makes it great to work in tech outside of Silicon Valley and New York City. What are sort of the day-to-day things that you would suggest anyone here on Unvalley or anyone who watches this video later could do to help support the Rise of the Rest movement?
Well, I think it starts with understanding that you're part of a community, and obviously you're going to focus on whatever you're doing, if it's a startup or whatever you're working on. Of course, that has to be kind of front and center, but recognizing you're part of a broader community. What can you do to support that community? What can you accelerate the community, which is a way to help the community, but frankly also help yourself, because if your city is rising and it's able to attract more talent, able to attract more capital, kind of all boats will lift. So in some ways it's self-serving, but it starts with not being self-serving. It's recognizing that there's a role you can play and really need to play in being part of your startup community, being a leader and trying to take it to the next level. The second goes back to what I said before, is it's recognizing collaboration is critical. There's an African proverb, you've heard me say a lot of times when I've been on the road, if you want to go quickly, you can go alone, but if you want to go far, you must go together. And so how do you build a collaborative effort so you can go together, including figuring out ways to connect with others in your community, including folks on the policy side, like your local mayor or some of the bigger companies, or as I mentioned earlier, universities. So how do you kind of create this broader community that really allows you together to do things you really couldn't do on your own? A third is to be successful. One of the great things about that really puts startup cities on the map is somehow a breakout success, and say, I didn't know we could do that. AOL happened to be one of those companies here in the Washington, D.C. area. Dell was obviously that in Austin, Microsoft, and then later Amazon was that in Seattle. More recently, ExactTarget, now part of Salesforce, as you well know, was that in Indianapolis. You're seeing more. Pluralsight just this week, it was acquired by Vista in Utah. When you see those successes, it creates kind of a more of a sense of possibility and momentum. Just as the first time until somebody climbed Mount Everest, nobody thought it was possible. Once one person did it, people said, well, obvious it's possible. I think I'll go do it too. The first guy to, kind of break the 4-minute mile, most people thought that wasn't possible. He did it. Suddenly it was possible. Suddenly a lot of people are running sub, 4-minute miles. And the same dynamic is true with these companies. Having a breakout success really lifts the community. Then some of the early employees, early investors have some capital, start investing in seed rounds, angel rounds for some of the companies in the area, or take their expertise and start their own companies, and momentum begets momentum. And so that's how you go from kind of a early stage kind of startup community to something that's really thriving. So there are a lot of different factors. And as I said before, and Brad Feld talks about this in his latest startup community book, this is really including what he found in Boulder when he started working on this, I guess more than a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago, is you needed to bring like a 20-year mindset to it. So there aren't going to be overnight successes in the startup community world. It's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of collaboration over a long period of time. I mean, you got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. Well, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you certainly have seen a lot of waves in the tech sector specifically, and have been involved in a lot of different startups. Do you have any predictions for 2021 and 22 and 23?
Well, I think it's easier to see where things are going. It's sometimes more difficult to pick a particular time. Again, I saw this with AOL when we started a company in 1985, 35 years ago this past summer. At the time, only 3% of people were online. They're only online 1 hour a week. It seemed obvious to me and our team that the internet was going to be a big deal. For the better part of a decade, we struggled. Most people didn't think there was that many reasons to get online, and it was kind of hard to do and kind of expensive at the time. There were a bunch of barriers to it, so we just had to keep pushing it. And finally, even that first decade was pretty hard. We almost didn't make it. The second decade was when things kind of really took off. So I've learned as a result that sometimes revolutions happen in a more evolutionary way, and you have to take a patient, perspective to it. But there definitely, it goes back to what we were talking about before, some things that have accelerated over the past year. I think there is more interest in recognition of the importance of startups, not just in places like San Francisco, New York, and Boston, but more broadly. There are more mayors. I speak a lot at conferences of mayors, of the Governors Association. I think they are now more focused on new companies, not just existing companies. Their economic development strategies are embedded around startup communities, not just trying to lure factories or headquarters from other places. So that's a positive, but we still need to build on that and use this as an opportunity to really kind of seize the moment and really put some points on the board in terms of what can happen over the next few years. And I think people will be pleasantly surprised by what's possible there. In part because, as you referenced, referenced my book, The Third Wave, that some of these sectors that are most up for grabs, like healthcare, are super important parts of our lives. It's 1/6 of our entire economy, and it's dispersed across the country, where some of the very best medical organizations, Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, Hopkins in Baltimore, Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, MD Anderson in Texas, et cetera, and some of the most important healthcare companies are spread all around the country, which creates opportunities in healthcare for the entrepreneurs in those sectors, in those places, to thrive in the next decade, but only if they're able to attract the people, attract the capital, and can be part of a growing, thriving startup community.
How can people in the Powder Keg community and in this unveiling movement support what you're doing with Rise of the Rest and support Rise of the Rest companies?
Well, I do think it goes back to kind of building confidence, building enthusiasm, building a sense of possibility. I mentioned the early days of AOL when we were struggling, people didn't believe. You just have to keep telling the story. And I think obviously you and most of the people I imagine on this call have been at this for a while, have been pushing, feels like pushing the rock uphill sometimes, and sometimes it's even 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but have been on this journey for a while. I think recognizing this does seem like a moment. There's something happened here, in part because of the pandemic, that could change the trajectory over the next decade or so around innovation in this country, and could lead to a lot of these rising city opportunities. In terms of what we're doing, help us tell the story, whether it be on social media or some of the companies we backed, introducing them to other people so they can be successful. How do you also make sure you're telling the story of the different cities that we and many of you are participating in? If you do see interesting companies that you think we should consider investing in, let us know. Our whole strategy is around partnerships. We've now invested with over 350 regional venture firms as partners in the company, where we're trying to basically be part of a investor group, not lead those rounds. And we're really trying to create a more collaborative effort so that kind of all boats lift. So I appreciate you asking the question. I think we'll keep fighting away and trying to do what we can to change the narrative around the importance of startups, change the narrative around the importance of a diverse innovation economy, not just a few people in a few places like on the coast, kind of seeing the benefit of the capital, the benefit of the jobs, and other people feeling left behind. Last one I'll make, and it's particularly true of this year, we did an initiative just a couple of weeks ago. We obviously couldn't hit the road because of COVID, so we weren't able to get on our bus, but we decided to do a virtual bus tour focused on equity, and particularly in this case, focused on Black founders. And we put a call out for proposals for a pitch competition. 450 companies, Black startups, Black-led startups applied. And then we narrowed it down and had the pitch competition recently. And there are some terrific companies. And we had then invited other investors, including some coastal venture capitalists. I think about 150 firms joined us and agreed to take meetings with some of the best companies. So how do you create a more inclusive innovation economy, not just in terms of place, which obviously is the core of Rise to Rest, but also in terms of people? And last point I'll make is just to remind people of the data. And most people probably know this, but it's so striking and indeed sobering. It's worth kind of keeping it front and center. And we talk about place. There's still a huge disparity. 75% of venture capital goes to just 3 states. The other 47 states fight over the remaining 25%. That's a problem. But it's an even bigger problem if you look at things like Black founders. 13% of our country is Black Americans. Less than 1% of venture capital goes to Black founders. 50% of our country is women. Less than 10% of venture capital goes to female founders. And this is a problem and something we all need to focus on. So part of what you can do, going back to your question, in your community is not just be focusing on startups in a broad sense, but figuring out a way to create a more inclusive innovation economy, more inclusive entrepreneurship community, which often means kind of getting out of your comfort zone, not just working with the people that you grew up with or went to school with or worked with, but figuring out ways to create a broader effort in your community that is more inclusive, so everybody really does feel like they have an idea, they have a shot at the American dream.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Steve. And I'm so glad that you could be our final speaker today. We've had other great speakers already on, like Gary Cooper, CEO at Reaply.
Yep, our winner.
And your winner from the virtual tour you mentioned. Arlen Hamilton had a great fireside chat around lunch today. And I think it just really connects all the dots of everything we've been talking about today. It has certainly been an evolution, and I think, as you just said so perfectly, sometimes revolutions take a more evolutionary approach. And so I want to say thanks for all that you do, Steve, with Rise of the Rest and Revolution, and thanks for being here today at Unvalley.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And hopefully this conference inspired you to, obviously, the fact that you're participating and listening right now, you care about this issue, you're involved in this issue. I would just urge you to double down in the coming months. This does feel like a moment, and the people that seize it are going to be the big winners. And we're trying to create as many of those winners with as many cities as we can, as quickly as we can, and look forward to partnering with all of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. I also want to say thanks to our partners at Establish for helping produce Unvalley today. And I want to encourage you to go over to the awards stage, where our friends at CLA are going to be presenting the final awards of the day for Best Tech Culture in the Southeast region, the Central and Mountain region, along with the Best Scale-Up Culture and Best Startup Culture. CLA helped us validate these awards, and they're one of the top 10 professional services firms in the country, and very much experts in helping tech companies with hiring, talent search, and finances. So go over to the awards stage and check that out. I will see you there. Thanks again.